So good morning, everybody. It's Paul Short here. I'm from Lloyd and Whyte. We're here today to talk through insurance for primary care networks. Before we start, though, we'd like to share a little bit about Lloyd and Whyte. So we're specialist healthcare insurance brokers. We've worked with doctors, dentists, optometrists, and chiropractors since '97. Lloyd and Whyte are an insurance partner for the British Medical Association, and we deal with over 2,000 GP practices in the UK. So I'm Head of Business Development at Lloyd & Whyte. I'm joined by Pete Lishman, the MD of Lloyd & Whyte today as well, who's acting as a panellist. Before we get started though, just wanted to run through some ground rules if I can. So we're going to host a few polls today and we'd be really grateful for your responses. Also, we'd aim to answer all questions we can, but if we can't get through all of them, we'll put a Q&A up on our website after the event. This recording will be available on our website too. So, the agenda for today, I'm just going to cover this off quickly and the basis of today's webinar. As I said, we really want to provide you with advice that we feel is really important for you to consider. We'll be looking at the following topics: primary care networks and how your PCN is set up. There may be varying insurance considerations for or depending on how you're set up. By the way, throughout the call, I'm going to be referring to primary care networks as PCN. So the second topic will be the roles within your PCN, just to set the scene, really. We also want to highlight a potential indemnity exposure to you all. Really want to talk about how directors and officers liability applies to you and potentially your PCN, and also practice managers and GP partners. The next topic will be employers and public liability and potential changes that you need to make. And then we'll look at some next steps for you and any questions you may want to ask. So just to set the scene, this is really a whistle-stop tour of your insurance requirements. It's not going to be heavily detailed. We just want to be able to provide some bite-sized chunks for you to take away with you today. So your PCN and its setup. The BMA back in March released what they termed as structures that they put forward. Our awareness of PCNs at Lloyd & Whyte is that each PCN will most likely fall into the structures listed here. We believe that each has varying insurance considerations. So for example, a PCN set up in a flat practice structure may share employment contracts across the network. Consideration for a flat practice structure would be: how has each GP practice adjusted its surgery policy to make sure their employers and public liability is correct? Looking at the roles within primary care networks. So we understand that roles within PCNs will grow and broaden over time as the PCNs mature, the activities you're involved with, etc. But when first setting up each PCN, you're required to appoint a clinical director who really is accountable for providing leadership and strategic direction to the PCN itself. We believe that you're focusing on improving quality, cost, and effectiveness of services being offered. We also think a clinical director's role is so wide that we can't really cover off the expectations here today, but we feel it's clear that it's a decision-making role, very much influential in implementation. Now, there may be other decision-makers, officers and managers in the PCN working on your behalf or working together, such as practice managers. And as the PCN develops, it will be required to appoint other positions such as clinical pharmacists and a wider workforce. So as a PCN grows, it's really important to consider that the insurance and risk exposures will alter with it as well. The third bullet here is about the workforce, and the workforce will be acting in roles in primary care. They'll be responsible for delivering those wider care services. So I think it's also important right now in terms of how you're setting up your PCN is to consider their travelling requirements and also their changing nature of their roles and how they're going to be involved in the PCN. So I'm going to cover off a little bit about indemnity exposure and where we feel in terms of the state indemnity, etc., has moved in the last 6 months or so. So we believe that there may be a potential indemnity exposure to decision makers within primary care networks, which I am going to cover off. As a clinical director, though, we mainly believe it's strategical and implementation. So there is some guidance to this that it is non-clinical in terms of its main purpose. Now, in the last 6 months, indemnity requirements have changed for many practitioners, so I just wanted to talk this through. Our introduction of CNS-GP or state-backed indemnity scheme in April 2019, clinical negligence will be picked up by the scheme for NHS clinical work, so that's a big tick there. Now, to ensure private work or for cover for GMC hearings and Good Samaritan Acts, cover is provided by a medical indemnity provider or an insurance policy. So there's a big tick there as well. But have you thought about non-clinical exposure? And what do we mean by that? So the NHS resolution scope table suggests that, and we do suggest that you do check with the NHS resolution on this basis, that they will not provide indemnity to practices or their staff for other business liabilities. Now, please check this with the NHS resolution. We feel that it might be a hole in terms of indemnity. It may be more suitable for you to consider a professional indemnity policy or professional services insurance for the non-clinical aspects of your work. So there may be a little cross there for you to consider after this webinar today. Moving on, there's a topic here in terms of directors and officers liability. Some of you on the call may have heard of directors and officers liability insurance and others may not. Now, it's important consideration for PCNs and GP partnerships, but not just that, it's for officers within a GP partnership or the PCN setup as well. So when talking through the roles within the PCN, we highlighted that the role of a clinical director is a decision-making one, and it's a position of accountability. A director and officer in either a PCN or a GP practice will be a person acting in that position of responsibility. For example, the clinical director is responsible for implementing strategy within the PCN. A partner in a GP practice is responsible and duty-bound to run the GP practice within certain guidelines and frameworks. Now, often, officers and organisations are forgotten about, and an officer is a manager or supervisor who is and has responsibility to make decisions and is accountable for making them. Key person here will be a practice manager. Each director, partner, or officer has the duty to perform within their roles also. Now, a person acting in a director or officer role can be exposed to allegations of wrongdoing. I'm just going to talk that through quickly now. They can come from regulators, from patients, from partners, suppliers, employees, but the list is quite wide. Now, a few examples of wrongdoing could be a breach of contract, a breach of trust, certainly mismanagement, racial discrimination, and also wrongful dismissal. So if it's alleged that a decision maker has breached their responsibility, they can be accused of wrongdoing. Where does directors and officers liability cover come in? Now, the cover is provided on the basis that there has been negligence. Now, a directors and officers insurance will react where you're accused of wrongdoing and is designed to cover the legal proceedings brought against you and provide damages in the event that a defence is not successful. Now, an example in the GP practice world, which is covered by AXA Insurance PLC, came as a regulatory action against a GP practice. A GP practice faced a claim from their primary care commissioner alleging they had been overpaid by some £150,000. Now, this followed what was thought to be a friendly inspection of patient records. AXA had to intervene. Expert legal fees in defending the case, and a settlement in the case came to more than £30,000. So AXA had paid out in terms of a cost £30,000 within that incident. And this is just one example of how legal action can be brought against you in the healthcare sector. I want to cover off personal liability here, though. Now, the individuals holding the positions of director, partner, or officer can be held personally liable for their actions or omissions they make in certain poor performance in their duties. This means that they can personally be subject to claims which could lead to the payment of fines, compensation, and potentially imprisonment. Now, important consideration here is you will have to cover the cost if you're held personally liable, and if there is no directors and officers insurance in place, then you will have to pay for that cost yourself. Now, we're going to talk a bit about employers and public liability. As I said at the start, this is really a whistle-stop tour of what we feel you should be considering. This is probably the highlight in terms of how different structures can impact employers and public liability, and then what you may need to work on in terms of changes to your current insurance policies you have in place. Now, directors and officers, in our view, applies to all primary care networks and GP partnerships as a requirement. You should all be considering that because of your responsibilities in your roles. But employers and public liability risks will impact different PCNs depending on how they are set up. I'll give the example here of limited company versus flat or lead practice structure. Employers' liability is a legal requirement in the UK. So if you have recently set up a new limited company and do not have employers' liability, it's essential that you put this in place and act on it quickly. Public liability protects your business against third parties, provides you legal costs and compensation if you're negligent in causing bodily injury or property damage to a third party. If you have recently formed a limited company and it exists as a separate and its own legal entity in its own right, a policy should be issued in the name of the limited company. Now, this is going to differ for flat or lead practice structures. Under a flat practice structure, each GP practice should consider extending their surgery policy, which I do hope you all have in place, to include primary care network activities. So rather than just appearing on a scheduler's GP partnership, it would then appear as GP partner and primary care network. If a lead practice structure is in place, typically the lead practice should extend its surgery policy to include the activities of primary care network. So that lead practice would extend its policy to, say, GP partnership and primary care network. In both scenarios, as the employer, you're extending the place of work for your staff and your workforce, and you should advise your insurance brokers that this change is happening. As staff move around under a flat practice model, it's quite important to think about how the relationship with particular staff members may influence the cover you have or you need. So, for example, if a staff member travels from X practice and goes to Y practice, located at a different site, it's really important for practice Y to consider the relationship with that staff member, especially if they now fall under your direct control and supervision. So the employer's liability becomes a little bit more of a grey area. It's also important to think about your duty of care towards the workforce coming into your practice for the first time. So like any other new person you'd have, you should have usual induction plans, provide necessary training, equipment, and information they need to do their job properly. So that duty of care principle is taken into account. To finish then, we'd like to welcome some questions. We will try and answer them as best we can. There is a Q&A option where you can write a question into the webinar, and then we'll either be able to answer it on the webinar now, either by typing back to you or by covering it off on the call. Or if not, then you can actually email us and we will answer that question and politely come back to you that way. So if you do have any questions, please let us know. We'll leave the webinar open for the next sort of 5 minutes if you do have any, so we can come back to you. Thanks very much for participating today.
Yeah, hi. So Penelope, we've had a question from you around not having any employees in present, so you don't clearly need the employer's liability cover as it stands, and you haven't really launched any new services yet. So probably nothing to think about right now, but as and when you launch, if you're subcontracting, and presumably that will be a point where maybe you have employees, maybe you don't, you certainly still need to think about extending your public liability for the relevant practices, because there is still a contingent liability if the subcontractors fail, etc. If in any doubt, give us a shout separately or talk to your broker.
I have a second question from Oman there. So in effect, yes, you'll have to extend the cover. So if you're working a flat practice model, each individual practice should extend employers and public liability to include the primary care network activities. Now, typically we would see that a practice liability and the liabilities would be covered by an insurance company or a broker. However, Peninsula may be providing wider HR services to you. So please try and find out who your insurance broker before making that change. Hope that helps.
Okay, yeah, so we've had a question from Andrew around clinical staff and the state cover and other places of work. So yeah, in terms of clinical cover, Yes, the state indemnity scheme will cover home visits for any clinical staff, as should your for any private work. So the answer is yes. Just one other point around this as well. I would hope that everyone involved has seen a reduction in the cost of their medical indemnity insurance over the last 12 months as a result of the state indemnity scheme. If you haven't, it's very much worth having a chat with your providers, because you should have seen quite a substantial reduction. Yeah, hi Richard, we've had a couple of questions from you. So in terms of subcontracting from a third party, and you assume they're covered by their employer, absolutely, yes, you should. However, as with any subcontracting, part of your due diligence should always be to ensure they do have that cover in place. Similarly, whether it be directors and officers insurance or whatever other cover you have in place, there will be that contingent liability there, assuming you've had directors and officers cover. The second question you ask is, would officer insurance for a GP partner cover them from fines from data breaches or from NHS ombudsman fines? So the answer is yes, it would, but there are issues around cyber cover. So this is a really complex one. So yeah, data breaches will be covered under a directors and officers policy, but there are some limitations around the cause of that when there's been cyber attacks, for instance, and it's worth practices thinking about cyber insurance. But that's a far more detailed one. That's one to discuss with the broker to talk about what the right requirements for a particular practice or PCN.
Thanks, for your second question. Yes, you should be contacting the Defence Union to extend your cover to include the activities of the clinical director role. As we discussed during the webinar, we feel that that's really a non-clinical part of what you will be doing day to day. Your current policy provided by the Defence Union will not include directors and officers cover. So that is typically a standalone insurance policy, which either GP partners or say a network will be buying.